Picture a line of people stretching for a mile, crawling up a snowy mountainside. 30 below zero, biting wind slashing at their faces. And every single one of them is hauling nearly 100 pounds of gear on their backs. Over 100,000 people did exactly this during the Klondike gold rush of 1897. They quit their jobs, left their families, walked away from everything, just to climb that mountain and strike it rich. But here is the historical truth. 99% of them came back empty-handed. Many never came back at all. So, who actually made money from this gold rush? It wasn't the guys freezing on the mountain. It was the guys sitting in a port city 1,000 miles away, selling shovels to the gold diggers. I'm Dave, and today we're going back to Seattle, 1897, to see what happens when a city stops hunting for gold and starts selling the shovels instead. First, let's look at the map. In July 1897, a steamboat docked on the west coast of the United States. It was carrying 2 tons of gold from the far north of Canada. By morning, the news hit the papers. By afternoon, the whole country knew. Farmers abandoned their fields. Doctors closed their clinics. Teachers walked out of their classrooms. Everyone wanted to head north. But you couldn't just walk there. You had to get to a West Coast port, stock up on supplies, board a ship, and sail thousands of miles north. So, which port would be the jumping-off point? If you look at pure geographic logic, the obvious answer was San Francisco. Bigger, wealthier, they already had experience from the 1849 gold rush. Their port infrastructure left Seattle in the dust. So what did Seattle have in 1897? It was basically a muddy logging town tucked away in a remote corner of the country. It rained non-stop. The population was barely 80,000. Logically, there was absolutely no reason for prospectors to choose Seattle. Yet, somehow, almost all of them ended up there. And the reason had nothing to do with geography. What dragged hundreds of thousands of people to a soggy logging town? The answer lies with a man that history has almost completely forgotten. His name was Erastus Brainerd. He wasn't a miner. He wasn't a merchant. He wasn't a politician. He was a journalist. And he had just been appointed secretary of the Seattle Chamber of Commerce. Looking at the chaos, Brainerd saw a glaring opportunity. Hundreds of thousands of men were trying to decide which port to travel to, and they were going to make that decision based on what they read. If he could control the information, he could control the stampede. Brainerd took the chamber's budget and fired up the printing presses. Maps, pamphlets, guidebooks. Millions of them. He shipped them to every post office, library, and city hall across America. He bought out ad space in European newspapers. He sent press kits to London, Paris, and Berlin. And every single piece of paper hammered home the exact same message. Seattle is the only gateway to the Klondike. Seattle is the only place to buy your supplies. The truth is, this was a blatant lie. You could easily go through San Francisco, Portland, or Victoria up in Canada. Those routes were shorter, cheaper, and made much more geographic sense. But Brainerd's propaganda machine was so overwhelming that, when a guy decided to go dig for gold, he didn't even bother looking at a map. He just blindly bought a train ticket straight to Seattle. San Francisco didn't lose this turf war because they were the worst option. They lost because Seattle printed more paper. But getting people to Seattle was only step one. The next problem was, how do you force them to empty their wallets before they get on the boat? And the solution didn't come from Seattle. It came from the Canadian government. When the Canadian government saw this tidal wave of humanity heading for the Yukon, they didn't see an economic boom. They saw a looming humanitarian disaster. Tens of thousands of city folks with zero survival skills, throwing themselves into one of the coldest, most unforgiving wildernesses on Earth. The Northwest Mounted Police set up checkpoints at the border and issued a ruthless mandate. No one crosses into the Yukon unless they are carrying enough food and survival gear to last an entire year. 1 ton of supplies, nearly 2,000 pounds of gear per person, 400 pounds of flour, tents and sleeping bags rated for 30 below zero, heavy wool clothing, iron picks and shovels, food and medicine for 12 months. Think about the economic impact this law had on Seattle. The Canadian government effectively ordered that anyone stepping off a train in Seattle must spend a fortune on supplies before they could leave. These guys came here dreaming of getting rich. But before they even saw a single fleck of gold, they were forced to hand over their life savings to the merchants of Seattle. Not because Seattle was great at sales, but because Canadian law forced them to buy. So, how did Seattle react to this absolute gift from the gods? What do you do when a whole city realizes that a line of customers is waiting outside, and they have no choice but to open their wallets? Seattle transformed practically overnight. Imagine what the city looked like. Dirt roads churned into thick black mud from the constant rain. Freight wagons jammed tight, gridlocked in a sea of frantic people rushing in from all over the country. People pitching tents right on the sidewalks. The air thick with the smell of freshly cut pine, mixed with sweat, horse manure, and pure raw greed. In the midst of this chaos, every single business pivoted instantly. Bakeries tossed out their pastries to make room to display snow sleds. Pharmacies cleared out cough syrup to stock up on iron pickaxes. Tailors who used to cut elegant suits were now staying up all night, hunched over, stitching thousands of fur-lined parkas. Goods were piled as high as mountains, spilling right to the edge of the muddy streets. Prices skyrocketed to insane levels. But here right now, nobody complained. Haggling didn't exist, because these gold-crazed dreamers didn't have a choice. And one of the hottest commodities? Sled dogs. Miners needed dogs to haul their ton of gear over the frozen passes. The demand was so crazy that stray dogs were being stolen off the streets of cities across America, shoved into wooden crates, shipped to Seattle, and sold to desperate miners for hundreds of dollars a pop. In 1897, flipping dogs in Seattle was more profitable than panning for gold. Even the mayor of Seattle at the time took one look at those fat profit margins, immediately resigned, and opened a steamboat ticket company to Alaska. But the most memorable story of this gold rush doesn't belong to the mayor or to Brainerd the journalist. It belongs to a young Swedish immigrant. He arrived in Seattle right as the frenzy was peaking. He climbed that snowy mountain too. But when he returned with a little seed money, instead of rushing back into the illusion of the next gold strike, he realized the truth. The biggest gold mine was right there in Seattle. He watched these miners dumping their life savings into supplies, and he realized a very simple fact. If you're walking through the snow, you need a good pair of boots. So he didn't buy a ticket back up north. He pooled his savings and opened a shoe store right in Seattle. That young man's name was John W. Nordstrom. That tiny shoe store was the foundation of a retail empire, one that is still standing and raking in billions to this very day. In 1899, the gold rush ended. Those men on the mountain, most came back broke, exhausted, and drowning in debt. Many never made it back at all. And Seattle? This town kept the millions of dollars it drained from the prospectors' pockets. Seattle used that money to pave its streets, build a massive commercial port, and lay the foundation to become the economic powerhouse of the Pacific Northwest, a position Seattle still holds today. But the real takeaway here isn't just about Seattle. It's the timeless rule behind it. Sell the shovels during a gold rush. From the dot-com boom to crypto to the current AI wave, the mechanics have never changed. Only the shovels look different. People are always busy chasing the illusion at the end of the rainbow. But history always repeats itself. True wealth belongs to the ones who control the road to get there. But that is a story for another journey. Until next time.